You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Barbara Mendes-Jorge, and I am a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. This is the second instalment of our two-part episode with Louise Ayling, Director of Sustainability and a board member at Radley, Yeldar. If you haven't listened to part one yet, please do go back into our catalogue to listen to it first. So welcome back, Louise. We finished the last episode talking about an extremely interesting report that your organisation, RY, produced. It's called Words That Work, Effective Language in Sustainability Communications. And we discussed some of the main issues affecting sustainability communications and the concept of stock sustainability. But I was wondering, could you go a bit more deeper into what you see that the problem is that the Words That Work report identified when it comes to sustainability communications?
Yeah, of course. So I guess we kind of framed or identified three main problems when it comes to the way that sustainability is communicated through language. The first of those is jargon. So sustainability language often really works for insiders, but the technical terms used to communicate sustainability alienate pretty much everyone else. And also, don't get me started on the acronyms. There's just so many of them in the sustainability
I'm based in
space.
Brussels. Listen, I get it.
And so nothing really kills people's interest faster than impenetrable jargon. So that was kind of framed as our first big challenge. The second is that it's too macro. Sustainability is a really big, complicated topic, and people seem to communicate it in really big, complicated ways. They use big sweeping statements about the scale of the problem we face, which aren't usually relatable enough to resonate with people. So that's the second problem. And then the third problem that we identified is that overused language becomes quite meaningless. So if everyone defaults to the same language, words get overused and lose their meaning. And we're also seeing this real kind of mixed and matched combination of overused words and phrases, which exacerbates the problem and makes it worse. So yeah, those three factors in combination kind of lead to a lack of engagement, reduced differentiation and limited action when it comes to sustainability.
Yeah, and I think these are very important. When I've been giving my anti-greenwashing trainings, I'm obviously also asked for kind of good examples of communications. And I have been giving the Patagonia sustainability website as an example. It may have changed since I last presented it, but what's really interesting is when you go on that website, there is no mention of sustainability anywhere. It's all about impact and what they're doing and progress. Because, yeah, as you say, people switch off with the word sustainability sometimes. And I think in the last few years, you feel similarly with kind of net zero, carbon neutral, they're becoming increasingly used as a shield and used inaccurately. And companies really need to think about, if they're going to use those words, what are they using to back them up? Speaking of terminology, I wanted to ask you what your views are on the word greenwashing, because I obviously even mentioned that I've used your work a lot in my own anti-greenwashing trainings, but actually I found it interesting that I could only find it once in the latest Words the Work report. Is that a word that you use a lot to explain sustainability communications to your clients? How do you feel about it?
It's interesting, actually. I hadn't done the count. So yeah, fascinating that we only used it once.
I did a cheeky control F.
Yeah. Greenwashing is a term that's really been quite extensively used in the sustainability space for quite a long time, really. I think it's a helpful prompt for organisations to make sure that they've got the evidence to support their claims. I'm seeing the language of greenwashing kind of creep more into the consciousness of the general public, kind of outside of the realm of sustainability professionals. And I think it's good because it means that more people are actively aware and calling out organisations whose communications might feel inauthentic or inaccurate. Brands can't really get away with putting the label sustainable on a product anymore and hoping that people will just buy into it without scrutiny. I think what's interesting, though, is the evolution of the concept of greenwashing and the language used. So we're seeing terms like green hushing and green wishing as kind of new terms on the block. Green hushing is the consequence of greenwashing allegations, really. So brands are increasingly afraid to be called out for greenwashing, and so instead they stay quiet, which is something that you kind of alluded to earlier on in the podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And from my perspective, this is as damaging as greenwashing, really, kind of shying away from being transparent through fear of being called out for greenwashing. And then green wishing relates to expressing desires or intentions to be more sustainable without taking concrete action. So the terminology, I guess to your point, greenwashing and then green wishing and green hushing, perhaps a little naff. And personally, I'm not a fan of the use of the word green, but the concepts themselves are a good reflection of organisations' behaviour.
I think greenwashing, like sustainability, suffers from the problem that people often think it only relates to environmental issues, and it doesn't, right? So, sustainability is also social issues and then often gets lost. I think at its most basic level, people think environment equals carbon emissions, and obviously it is so much more than that, and companies have to do so much more than that. So yeah, that's very interesting. Greenwashing is naff. I'm doing a greenwashing training next week. I will start with that. You mentioned that you work on sustainability reports, and I know that the RY office you work in is in the UK and therefore outside of the EU, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the European Commission's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the related European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which are going to impact companies with more than 50,000 employees on sustainability reporting, because they've come with these, disclosures that you have to fit in, very detailed and targeted, which as a storyteller kind of takes the fun out of it and the engagement potentially. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and kind of the state of greenwashing legislation, maybe in the UK, in Europe and the US.
Yeah, absolutely. Big question.
We
are, as you say, based in the UK, but we have a global client base. So CSRD, ESRS is affecting the majority of our clients, I would say. I could talk about it for days, but I'll try and keep it short. Basically, it's a huge piece of legislation, and the sentiment of what CSRD is trying to do, in my opinion, is great. For a long time, sustainability reporting has contributed to this notion of sustainability as usual. Organisations have reported on and disclosed progress, in inverted commas, that's kind of incremental at best. And the reporting standards and frameworks, many of them, have facilitated this pattern by really focusing on information and metrics to disclose, rather than really looking at raising the bar for the efforts organisations need to make in order to achieve the outcomes necessary to kind of genuinely move the needle towards sustainability. And I think the conflation between ESG and sustainability has really exacerbated that problem. So CSRD feels like a really insurmountable hurdle to a lot of organisations. Some of our clients have had legal teams poring over it for months who still are saying they can't quite make head nor tail of it. I think, to be honest, the way the standards and the way that they've been written has been communicated has made them incredibly impenetrable. So CSRD has kind of done themselves and everyone else a bit of a disservice there. But the reason I'm on board with CSRD is because I think the intent at the heart of what it's trying to do is really admirable. It's driving a shift towards recognising and quantifying an organisation's impact on the world around it, and it's prompting a more collaborative approach to managing sustainability issues within business. So we're working with a few clients at the moment to develop their materiality assessments in line with the new requirements, and we're bringing together finance teams, risk teams, sustainability teams who are having to tackle the new requirements together. And it's leading to some really fascinating conversations and quite a few head-scratching moments. And I guess from my perspective, I feel like CSRD could go a lot further. The most useful frameworks or kind of strategic frameworks for business transformation, in my view, are the Future Fit benchmark and the new Sustainable Development Performance Indicators. They're far more progressive from a kind of transformational change perspective, but CSRD is a refreshing change compared to the kind of frameworks of the past. But to your point, I think the real challenge here is the communications aspect. And CSRD and the requirements of ESRS are great from the perspective of forcing business to change the way they think about and address and measure sustainability. But it's enormous, and the disclosure requirements are so extensive, and the information is largely going to sit in companies' annual financial reports. So this opens up a really big communications gap. There's a huge opportunity for organisations to tell the story of their impact and their change, which CSRD is driving, in a more compelling way to a wider group of audiences outside of the annual report. And I think this can be done in hugely imaginative ways. So it will be really interesting to see the directions that companies take. The risk is that everyone at the moment is feeling so bogged down in the granular detail and the kind of legislatory requirements that the comms piece could be put on the back burner at the expense of, ticking all of the boxes, which would be a real shame. So I'm a really big advocate for doing what's needed to comply with CSRD, but then taking the spirit of that and turning it into really compelling communicative comms at a wider set of audiences that will also kind of instill belief in other areas too.
Lots of interesting points in your answer. I found it really interesting that you said that it's bringing different areas of the company, of your clients together who normally don't speak, who kind of have to now, right? And I am working with an organization at the moment who are actually, with their upcoming sustainability report, already going to try and do it in the ESRS format, knowing that, there'll be areas where they're like, we currently don't have any information, which I think if it works out is incredibly brave. Let's see what happens. Because what I've found, and maybe you found this with your clients as well, is, on the environment, because again, sustainability often is correlated with that. Yeah, we've got the carbon emissions details. We might have some, DE&I indicators, but oh my God, you have to go so much deeper now in talking about your actions, your targets, your metrics. You really can't shy away from what the ESRS is asking you to provide.
Yeah, it's so extensive, the kind of detail and the rigor that's required. And this focus on impact is the reason I'm particularly excited by it. But for a long time, organisations haven't really focused on impact in its truest sense. And so that's a big shift. And then, as you say, kind of, tackling materiality from an impact perspective and quantifying the financial impact that these topics have on the business requires the finance team, the risk team, and a quantification of sustainability related impacts that hasn't necessarily been tackled before within businesses. So it's causing a lot of really in-depth, fascinating discussions, but also quite a lot of panic.
Yeah, I think the panic is warranted, and I'm just really hoping that for companies that have sustainability teams within their organizations, that they can really get across to management that even if we don't have this information now, we will need it as soon as possible. So let's do a materiality assessment. Let's work on this, because then you're really going to potentially stand apart from your peers who will have done the work to do it. So that's I think I broadly agree. I think it's very interesting what you're saying of it is bringing a standard together. Fingers crossed that we can all decode that very long document and and communicate correctly as well as inspiringly with the ESRS. So we've mostly talked about some of the issues with sustainability communication, so it'd be nice to move towards some tips and solutions. In Words That Work, you outline 10 principles which address the root causes of bad sustainability writing. I was wondering if you could share 2 or 3 of the ones that you feel are the most important in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, there's 10. Choosing 2 or 3 is pretty tricky. But I've chosen, a couple of my favorites. So the first one is to get specific. We've touched on the fact that lofty macro statements really tend to alienate people. And while people don't always understand how everything in sustainability is linked together, they do tend to be quite knowledgeable and engaged around particular topics, particularly when kind of narrowed down to a specific category. So rather than saying this t-shirt is sustainable, it's better if organisations can specify that it's perhaps made from 100% organic cotton or whether it's ethically sourced, and then clarify why those attributes make it more sustainable. So Tony Stroccoloni a great example of this, and it's often held up as a good example of sustainability communications, also make great chocolate. They pin all of their sustainability communications around their concept of slavery-free chocolate. So their work around wider sustainability issues is still there and it's linked, but they narrow down the emphasis of their communications to a more kind of particular topic area. The second one that I've chosen to just reference is the need to bring in diverse voices and opinions, and link to that to make it more personal. In the report, we talk about the fact that there isn't one public, and I'd go further to say, there isn't one investor or one customer. People are all different, they have different experiences, and sustainability communications will sound the same if they're only written by people with the same backgrounds. So organisations should really look to bring in diverse opinions and voices to make sustainability more relatable and real. And so the more voices you bring in, the more audiences you can appeal to. And some practical ways of doing this are things like hiring untraditional copywriters, sourcing stories from a wider net, and really involving employees from different departments as you curate your sustainability communications. The third one, I've been a bit naughty and picked a couple more. The third one is to be honest. And this one I feel really strongly about. So painting an overly positive story leads to doubts, and organisations will lose trust. And as you talked about kind of earlier on in the first episode, organisations really shy away from addressing challenges and admitting faults. And in doing so, it kind of erodes transparency and kind of trust. I would say a little word of caution. Lately, there seems to have been a trend for what organisations are calling radical transparency in communications. And the trend seems to be mostly organisations promoting how transparent they are without really providing the evidence to prove it, as a kind of smoke screen, really, and the belief that if you say that you're transparent, then people will believe you. So I would say that's a real watch out. Be honest, but do it properly.
Is that green clear? What's the greenwashing term for that?
Oh yeah, we need to make one, don't we?
Oh, that's interesting. Radical transparency. Okay. Well, I mean, you mentioned Tony's Chocolonely, which made me laugh because I did have one of their advent calendars last year, and there was a day where you got 2 chocolates and the next day you got none, because they wanted to talk about exactly the slavery aspects that you mentioned, which
It's so
powerful
clever.
message, because as a consumer I was annoyed to not get my chocolate, but fair enough, Tony's Chocolonely. But I was wondering if you had any other examples of brands that who shifted their messaging and took some of those those practical steps, practical solutions that you've given to them to change their communications.
Yeah, great question. The research certainly resonates with people, and you mentioned the light bulb moment earlier. I think we definitely see that flicker of recognition on people's faces when they realise that they're guilty of a lot of these cliches in their own communications. One example I think that I could draw on is probably our work with Johnson & Johnson. They actually came to us as a result of the Words That Work research, and we created a set of communications guidelines for sustainability for them, so that their communications teams and their various brands can take a more aligned and effective approach to sustainability communications, recognizing that not all of their sustainability or not all of their communications professionals are sustainability experts. So helping them really understand how to avoid just reaching for those kind of standard cliches. It's also really resonated with our clients at Microsoft, and we've embedded the principles of Words That Work into our various reporting and strategic projects and work with them. And I'd probably mention the majority, I'd say, of our first time or early reporting clients, who usually start their communications around sustainability from a place of reaching for those typical sentences. I think it's just a kind of natural reaction for people. And then we help them to apply the principles and shift towards more effective messaging. But what I would say, and I guess reflecting on this question, is there are those tangible examples of where companies are using it, and it's really a recognizable shift. But more so, I'd say it's a kind of subtle and gradual shift stemming from a mindset change, really. I think what I notice is that the research helps people to reframe their perception of what sustainability communications ought to look and sound like. And many people have been using those standard lines and phrases thinking it's what they ought to say or it's how good communications should sound or look, without really thinking about the fact that it's often meaningless. So Words That Work has helped to unravel that perception and challenge that instinct. And then linked to that, I suppose, it's what we were talking about earlier, kind of helping companies recognise the need to be more vulnerable and transparent, opening up to that kind of true state of sustainability within the organisation, rather than just saying sustainability is in our DNA. So yeah, I guess that's a kind of slightly long-winded answer, but I'm curious. I think you mentioned that a few of your organisations that you work with have found it quite pivotal.
Definitely. I think when I read out the top 10 cliched statements, usually people, when I give the training, laugh because they're like, oh God. And, you know, as I say to them, I sometimes use those phrases. It's just when you use them in a decontextualized way, when you just say sustainability is in our DNA, full stop, and don't link it to, you know, because we are farmers and we founded this food company, something like that, which, you know, literally shows like it's a family company, to link to it. When you just say it in a decontextualized way, you know, it's very difficult for people to relate to it. And I think that's the problem. Like, working in this field, I know that if I see a company talking about how much they care about, whether it's about the planet or the people, anything else, I just switch off automatically. And I don't think it is just me from working in sustainability, but yeah, I've given, you know, I've mentioned your work when I've given trainings, and I find it really funny because I then not only do I have clients being like, oh, you know, we're now being really careful, you know, if we're talking about minimizing our environmental impact, we give reasons why, etc. But what I found that's been really helpful, and this is where the change really starts to happen, is clients who work with other people who obviously don't know who I am, may not know who you are, haven't seen the training, and they start saying, no, you can't say this in our joint communication. So it's kind of like my clients start training other people. So that has been so positive to see. I don't think, and never when mentioning Words That Work have I ever had like a backlash or anything like that. People see it and recognize it immediately. And I think, like you say, it is an initial step to improving sustainability communications, and it also depends on who you're giving the training to, because if you are giving it to a sustainability team or a communications team, it needs to go to, you know, it needs to be reflected back to the upper management. And I was very lucky with one of my clients that I did it initially for the marketing and communications team, but then they let me do it unfiltered to their CEO, who was broadly on board. And you know, when the CEO has seen those cliches, has seen that, even he by the end of the presentation was like, don't worry, I'm not going to use the word green anymore. So yeah, no, I'm very enthusiastic about the mindset shift that Words That Work has definitely helped my own clients. So thank you. Maybe to wrap up the second part, if you had one piece of advice for companies who were really keen to spot and avoid greenwashing, or let's say improve their sustainability communications, what would it be?
At RY, we always look at communications through two lenses. I think you mentioned it in the introduction. So we look at evidence and inspiration. And the combination of those two factors is really vital. So without evidence, you just have faith. And without inspiration, you just have trust. And so in the sustainability space, inspiration and therefore faith alone doesn't stand up to scrutiny. So to spot greenwashing, I'd say you really need to make sure that you've got the evidence to back up your claim and that you're communicating that evidence as well, because we can't just rely on that inspiration and faith aspect.
Absolutely correct. I have communicated in a similar way, talking about credibility and visibility, how you need both for good sustainability communications. Mm-hmm. That's great. I think you've already provided, you know, lots of inspirational sustainability communications campaigns that you've worked on. But to finish off, given that we've, you know, talked about the negative aspects of sustainability communications and given some tips, are there any final companies, organizations that you would like to guide our listeners towards so they can be inspired for their own sustainability communications?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many out there that are doing great things. I think that's important to recognise. We've obviously been kind of calling out some of the challenges. Outside of Radley Yeldar's work, I recently came across Nike's kind of Getting Back in the Game campaign of communications. And it's a campaign to get people to refresh or recycle their old Nike gear. And it does, from my perspective, a really great job of avoiding the word sustainable, and it's also really jargon free and audience centric and very personal as well, so I thought that was quite good. And then I'm biased obviously, but from the work that Radley Yeldar has done, and the team involved with WRAP, which is the Waste and Resources Action Programme, a charity working across the world to improve recycling. We've done lots of work over the years to apply behavioural science to communications around this really critical topic in order to change citizens' behaviour around recycling. So we've done numerous campaigns over the years focusing on everything from plastic waste to food waste to bathroom waste, and they're great examples of using the right visuals and the right language to affect change with that kind of behavioural science underpinning it. We've had some great results from that. So yeah, as I say, I'm biased, but I'd perhaps go and check those out.
And what a shame that we don't have a part 3 where we can talk about behavioral science and sustainability communications, because that is very interesting. But for now, you'll have to check out Words That Work by Radley Yeldar. And I'd like to thank you, Louise, for joining us today for part 2. And thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board. You can visit our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.